Welcome back to another episode of the Seafarer Social Podcast. Today, I am with a very special guest joining me from the other side of the world in New Zealand. This is Eric Holliday. Eric is the Chief Executive of the Fish Safety Foundation and a consultant at ProSafe Marine. Now, we don't typically cover this area in Seafarer Social in terms of fishing, but I've spoke to Eric before we recorded this podcast a week or so ago, and he kind of opened my eyes to an area of seafaring that I think doesn't get enough recognition. I know there's a lot of fantastic charities out there, but there are a lot of stories, a lot of situations, a lot of circumstances that I've learned in just a short period of time around the world of fishing. And we're going to look into a little bit more of those today. But the first things first, Eric, is how are you?
Good. It's, as you introduced me, coming from New Zealand. Welcome everybody from the lovely country down in the South Pacific. It's always good to connect to the rest of the world.
Yeah. Well, it's a pleasure to have you on, and thank you so much for taking the time in your evening to speak to me. So, Eric, let's get straight into it. Tell me about Fish Safety Foundation.
Okay, Carl. Yeah, maybe I should start right at the beginning. You're speaking about the difference between the maritime sector, and you don't normally speak to the fishing sector. I'm a mariner by trade. I went to sea. We won't go into the years. It's a while back. But I went to sea as a marine engineer. Lucky enough to sail around the world. Born in South Africa, so was in those years I was lucky enough to go overseas. Fishing, I have to say, was the furthest from my mind. The only time I as a commercial mariner, the only time we interacted with fishing vessels was when they got in the way. My first ship was on a 300-meter long iron ore carrier sailing from South Africa to Japan. And I have to say my deckside counterparts weren't very complimentary about fishing boats crossing the bow and getting in the way and all types of things. So, as I said, an engineer, stayed a few years at sea, and as happens to a whole bunch of us, met a woman, decided to come ashore. So did what ex-marine engineers did and got involved in engineering shoreside. It was there that I was actually working in the brewing industry, in the hop industry, which is a good place to go for ex-mariner, to stay with the beer and now start making the beer. But in that role, I had a boss who came to me one day and said, Eric, you need to manage the health and safety of the team. And I remember looking at him and saying, but that doesn't make sense. I'm a youngster. These guys in the factory are all a lot older than me. Why can't you just tell them to be careful and, take responsibility for your own safety? I remember him saying, well, it doesn't quite work like that. So anyway, long story short, went on this safety training course, an intense 3-week safety training course. And there I had a couple of perceptions. My perceptions changed. One of them was that as an engineer, safety is just an engineering thing. So if there's a machine that needs to be protected in some way, we engineers will put a machine guard on. And if there's a gate that needs to be open and needs to have a micro switch to prevent entry or something, we do that. And if the rest of the team doesn't follow all the safety requirements or don't follow the safety requirements, we just go to HR and they get fired. Safety is easy. And while I was on this course, I actually met an industrial psychologist. And this guy was really, really interesting. He said to me, when I explained my theory of understanding safety, he said, actually, there's another side to it. We talk about human factors. And human factors is that whole perception and cognition and decision making and all the psychology of safety. And that's actually what hooked me. Anyway, following that, I guess, got the safety bug and I wanted to do something in safety. And in South Africa at the time, there was a National Occupational Safety Association. And I approached them and said, look, I'm an ex-mariner. I now getting some safety background. And I noticed you don't have a maritime department. How about I start a maritime department? I just took a punt. And it worked and I got in. And I then took what they had done shoreside on land-based industry. And they'd done it really successfully. They had a safety management system. They had really good training. And I started marinizing that, first of all, in a sort of commercial marine. We had lots of clients in anything from the Navy, the South African Navy at the time, harbour services, offshore diamond mining, all those type of things. So we could take what we'd learned in OSA and marinize. In fact, and I'm giving my age away now, but in '94, actually went across to London for the first time with my boss, and we then tried to sell this safety management system that we'd successfully worked in land-based things and now been moving it across to the maritime sector. Unbeknownst to us, the industry was busy developing and just about to launch the ISM code, International Safety Management Code, which all mariners will know, and I'm sure they love it all and they follow it all. But we were there too late, and we were coming with a product. But having said that, massively interesting, because for the first time went to the IMO, I met the folks at the Nautical Institute, where I'm still involved in now. And we just met a whole bunch of maritime people and went back to South Africa after that. I stayed with the organization for another couple of years. And then I went off on my own and I started my own maritime safety consultancy, taking that knowledge, working with industry. And it's a long-winded way of saying how the Fish Safety Foundation came about. But it was actually while I was running my own business in South Africa with ProSafe Marine, as you mentioned, that I was approached by a chap called Brand Wagner, who was the maritime specialist at that time for the International Labour Organization. And Brent was doing a study into fishing safety around the world, heard that I'd been doing some work in South Africa, Namibia, and wanted to know whether I had stats and figures and experience in the South African fishing industry. And I'd been working with some of the big players at the time, and I could give the ILO some background, some figures. He was looking for accident figures and numbers of people and all types of things. So I could give him some information, but it was actually at that stage, and this was in the late 90s, that I had this idea that we're not getting to everybody in fishing. And I had no idea what that meant, but I knew there were small scale fishers, and certainly even in South Africa and Namibia, most of the industry couldn't afford to pay a consultant to advise them about health and safety in the sector. And I knew there was something that could and probably should be done in that. Then, and as I said, this is the late 90s, sort of had this idea that at some stage I'll set up a charity, a non-profit. I couldn't even define it at that stage, but that was the idea then. And at the same time, then there was just another confluence of things that was happening. And I got asked by some of the international fishing trade magazines to start writing some articles about safety in the fishing sector. And I needed a name, couldn't just be Eric Holliday, from some nondescript consultancy. So I thought I'd need a fancy name. And at the time, I'd been looking at and thanks Flight Safety Foundation, but at the Flight Safety Foundation, which is the aviation counterpart. I mean, they're massive, but they're the body that independently work with industry, with the aviation industry to promote safety in that industry. So I thought, well, I'm just going to call it the Fish Safety Foundation, fish being fishing industry safety and health. So the acronym worked. And so I started writing, and all of a sudden I was Eric Holliday writing as CEO of the Fish Safety Foundation. But at that stage, it was nothing more than just a name. Anyway, moving on from that, the following year, beginning of 2000, Brent actually came down to South Africa, met him, and we started talking. And I started talking to him about this idea of starting a non-profit. And he was really supportive and keen. At that stage, I had no idea how do you get funding, how do you do this thing. So it was always just an idea. But I started doing some research and found out absolutely, the sector, the sort of commercial sector that I was assisting was really a really small part of world fishing. It was just, we're looking at 5% of the world's fishes. The rest was this great unknown in countries that I sailed past but had never been to. We started thinking about the Philippines and Vietnam and Indonesia and countries like that, and I certainly had no idea. Shortly after meeting Brent, we then as a family decided to move to New Zealand. As you do when you immigrate anywhere, you essentially start from scratch, and I went back to general consulting in New Zealand to start off with, And it was only in 2016 that I was doing some long-term consulting work, and I thought, well, I could either buy a nicer house or bigger boat or bigger car or whatever it is, or I could go back to this idea that had been floating around for 15, 16, 17 years and actually do something. And rightly or wrongly, or, whether it was a smart financial move or not, that's what we did. I started hiring some people, some really good people. Our team's always been small, but they've been really good. Started hiring that and registered as a charitable trust in New Zealand, made our intentions clear that we were going to work, internationally, and started marketing, pulling out and reconnecting with some of the old contacts that I had in maritime and that I'd made over the years, and especially in London. It is a really good place to start. And that's how we set up, and that's how we carried on. And then there were a number of things, depending how much detail you want to hear. But there were a number of breaks that we had. I was invited right near the beginning, within the first year or two, to London actually by Lloyd's Register Foundation. And they'd actually commissioned somebody else to look at where, as an organization, they should be heading. And that organization had heard my name somewhere along the traps in London, speaking to other people, contacted me, spoke about fishing as we're doing right now, and went back to Lloyd's Register Foundation and said there's actually a need to do something in the sort of global south, especially in the developing countries fishing sector. Lloyd's Register Foundation then contacted me, asked me to come up to London to chair a meeting of people we brought in from around the world. And that's how our association with them started. And that is really good. From that, we did a project with them or for them out in the Philippines, and then moved into a really big project in Bangladesh, etc., etc. And then in that started connecting with other funders. Pew Charitable Trusts out in the States was and is a very big supporter of ours. We started meeting with and being supported and doing projects for Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO. In that, continued talking to Brent at the ILO, started meeting the people at IMO and discussing things with them in terms of fishing safety. And that's really how we came about. And we've been lucky enough now to have worked across the world, anything from Caribbean to Africa to Pacific to South and Southeast Asia. Yeah, that's kind of
What a fantastic story to conception. What a fantastic story. I think it's interesting, isn't it, how just saying yes to opportunities can take you on such a crazy journey. And sometimes, taking ideas, throwing them at the wall and hoping people believe in you. And next thing you know, you're running a foundation is pretty interesting. But I think what I really want to get into the nuts and bolts about, Eric, and something that we spoke about before we recorded this is, and I think this is really, really important, is the misconception of a fisherman. Which sounds so basic, right? But when you broke it down to me, it was actually quite eye-opening. Now, I'm based in the south coast of England. We have the Solent here, and quite regularly on the weekends, on a Sunday, myself and my partner will go to the fish market and we'll buy some fresh fish, and it'll be served to us by a man who's usually in all yellow and been out somewhere nice in the Solent fishing off the coast of the Isle of Wight. That's not the reality for most fishermen. In fact, that's probably only about 5% of the world's fishermen, is what you said to me, right? So tell me about that other night.
Well, I mean, it's absolutely chalk and cheese. When I talk to people about the fishing sector, I make exactly that distinction that you've just made. What you see, this almost romantic picture of the small scale fisherman, in his yellow gear going out and then coming back and selling his fish off the stern of the vessel, and couples walking around and everybody having a wee yarn to him and everything looking good. That isn't the experience of the world's fishers. I've just come back from Thailand. They have something like 40,000 vessels in Thailand, and the general picture, and we went to a number of different ports right down south in the country and all over the country. When you look at the vessels there, when you look at the people working there, they're all fantastic people. But it's not your Solent, picture of the grumpy old fisherman going out there and doing his thing. It's just a totally different world. The standards are different on the vessels, for the vessels. The standards of training are different. If there's training, the standards in terms of legislation is different. Governance is different. Everything is just different. So your average fisherman, if I can take the world average, isn't in a big boat. He's in a small boat. He's a small scale fisher. In fact, something like 90% of the world's fishers small scale, if not more than 90%. The vast majority of them won't have life jackets. They won't have life rafts. They'll be on boats that aren't connected, definitely not by satellite. They'll have rudimentary safety gear on board. You talk to them about inflatable life rafts, and that is just it's just a blank. It's just, half of the fishermen there aren't wearing shoes. So that is your average fisherman, and your average fisherman could be in Thailand, could be in Indonesia, it could be in the Philippines, it could be in Bangladesh, it could be in India. So it's two totally different worlds. And then within fishing, if we compare and luckily I kind of work in both sectors, because I still do work in the maritime sector. So if you look at the users of the sea and you just start looking at some of the numbers, maybe that will give a nice way of looking at this thing. If you look at the numbers involved in fishing, if you look at the numbers involved in the maritime sector, what we call commercial maritime, the type that, the people that you'd be speaking to most of the time, there's different averages, probably 1.6 to 2 million seafarers out there in that sector. There's anything from 70,000 to 100,000 vessels. So that gives you some idea of that, the size of that sector. And they vary. Most of them will be SOLAS vessels, so it's sort of on bigger size. They are governed by a well-defined regulatory framework. You have the IMO giving essentially all their attention into that sector. If there's an accident, it will be well investigated by countries. That data will need to be reported to the IMO, and the data is then kept together, and there's different analysis done and meetings at IMO and all types of things. So it's a formal sector. If you then go across into the fishing sector, coming back to your earlier point, we need to see it as two different sectors. One is that 5% that you spoke about, and those will be the guys in the UK and the continent and Europe and States and Nordic countries and Canada and that type of thing, that fall under some sort of regulatory framework. To be fair, it's not very good, and I'm sure the IMO will excuse me for saying that, but we have these discussions all the time. So they'll be under some sort of framework. Give you an example of I guess the deficiencies in the framework. For the vessels in the fishing sector, we use 24 meters as a sort of cutoff point, and 24 meters and above is deemed to be a large vessel. And there's a convention that we as an industry have tried to get enforced for, I think it's something like 47 years now. So if your guests in the maritime sector have spoken about SOLAS, the Safety of Life at Sea Convention, the history of SOLAS is really interesting. In 1912, when the Titanic hit the iceberg and sank, they realized that there were deficiencies in safety, in life raft numbers and regulatory requirements for safety in that sector. So 1912, the Titanic sinks. By 1914, start of the First World War, the rudimentary SOLAS, Safety of Life at Sea Convention, came into play. And then subsequently, for the next 110, 120 years, that's been updated and modified. But essentially the same thing. SOLAS has always excluded the fishing sector. They are different industries, they've got different cultures, they've got different everything. So SOLAS has always excluded fishing. So back in the 70s, there was this realization that there should be a SOLAS equivalent for the fishing sector. And they then got together in Torremolinos out in Spain and put together what they called the Torremolinos Convention. And this was, I think, 77 or something that came out. And for all of these conventions, you require a number of countries, X amount of countries to sign it. with X amount of fishing vessels within their collective fleets. 77, nothing happened. Collectively, we couldn't get the numbers of, or the correct numbers of countries to sign this with the correct number of vessels. But some years later, and I think it was 83 or something like that, there was a Torremolinos Protocol, which then reduced the number of countries and it reduced the number of vessels to try and get in. It still didn't happen. In 2012, picked this thing up again. And I'm talking about the IMO picked it up again. And in Cape Town, changed it slightly. It's still essentially the same thing. It's still Torremolinos. It's now called the Cape Town Agreement. And we then reduced again the number of vessels and countries that needed to bring it into force. To date, we now have the number of countries, minimum number of countries signed up, but the vessel numbers still aren't high enough. The Cape Town Agreement, after, as I said, 47 or something years, is still not in place. You have an industry, fishing, which we know is the most hazardous industry in the world. You know, the rudimentary stats that they are, and I'm happy to talk about that a little bit later, show it to be the most hazardous industry in the world, still without even the most basic safety agreement in place.
And with and saying that, Eric, just to help the audience understand the kind of scale we're talking about right now, if they don't know, you mentioned earlier on around 1.6 to 2 million seafarers,
Yeah.
commercial seafarers, and around 70,000 to 100,000 commercial vessels. How many fishermen are we talking about, and how many vessels are we talking about worldwide? Just so we can put this really on a scale.
Good point. Here's the interesting thing. None of the UN agencies and I have to explain this. So there's three important UN agencies that get involved in this thing we call fishing. So it's the IMO, looking at essentially the vessel and with the Cape Town Agreement. The ILO, International Labour Organization, look at the Seafarer. In your maritime industry, you have the Maritime Labour Convention, MRC. The equivalent of that in fishing is the Work in Fishing Conventions. That is in force, but very few countries have signed that. So that's the equivalent there. And then you have the FAO, which gets involved in the actual fishing, the food side of it. Those three agencies, together with the industry, have great difficulty in defining exactly what a fisher is. Because the question arises, do we include somebody who's working in aquaculture? Do we include somebody who's working inland in lakes and rivers in countries? And the reality is that in many parts of the world, certainly Bangladesh and the Philippines, these fishers, they're all interchangeable. Sometimes they're working on the fish farm, sometimes they're fishing in a river, sometimes the boat goes out into the sea. So if we then look at that collective number of fishers, you're looking anywhere from estimates of from 60 million to 100 million. So it's just massively different. You know, just the quantum of people working in fishing is just massive. In fact, if you look at the people directly, these fishers, and the people then working in the allied parts of it, you know, the marketing and the cleaning and all those kind of services, you're looking at something like the estimate is between 10 and 12% of the world's population is involved in fishing in some other way. If you look at the importance of fishing, something like 17% of animal protein comes from fish. And in some countries, it's 70% of the protein that people get in is from fish. So it's just the numbers are massive. If you look at the numbers of fishing vessels, you know, we spoke about 80 to 60 to 100,000 in the commercial maritime. If you look at fishing vessel numbers, the numbers are estimated to be between 4.2 and 4.5 million vessels across the world. Now,
Wow.
This could be...
And just to be clear as well, Eric, these fishermen that we're talking about, these are not commercial fishermen that are going out and being paid a salary. These are people who are literally going out to feed their family. This is the reality, right?
By and large, you know, I mean, there's interesting figures about how much fish we catch, and that's estimated through the market. How much goes through the markets, and that's where organizations like the FAO get their estimate. Something like probably 50% of the world's fish that's caught never goes through a market at all, never goes through the formal food chain. It's a guy or two or three guys that is fishing from a small canoe that brings it ashore, and his missus picks it up and sells it or barters it or moves it on, and that's their way of life. It's subsistence. It is absolutely small scale. It's who they are. It's not a job. They are fishers. They are fishing families. So the numbers are just massive. If you look at 4.5 million fishing vessels, I want to come back onto something quickly, Carl. Of those 4.5 million fishing vessels, we spoke about that 24 meters and above, where we've struggled for more than 40 years now to get even a basic safety standard in place. Those 24 meters and above, that category is only 1.5% of the world's fishing vessels.
Wow.
So if you think of it this way, and at 68,000 or something, if you think of it this way, we spent 40 plus years trying to get an equivalent piece of legislation in place to the maritime industry that got it 2 years after the Titanic sank, and we still haven't got that. And even if we did get that in place, it would only apply to 1.5%
1.5%.
of the
Wow.
world's fishing vessels. So that's
That's
kind of where
crazy.
we are. Yeah.
You said earlier on as well, Eric, I want to pull you up on this too. You said we know that fishing is one of the most hazardous roles in the
Yeah.
world. Tell me about the reality in terms of safety. What are the threats that these fishermen face on a daily basis?
If you will let me give some background on that, because it's really interesting. It's incredibly sad as well. We, as a foundation, and this actually goes right back to that first conception of the Fish Safety Foundation. That work that the ILO, that Brand Wagner was doing back in the late 90s, when he contacted me about the figures, they were trying to find out exactly that: how many people die at sea, how dangerous is it, and and supplementary thing, how do they die and what are the dangers. From that study came a figure of 24,000 fatalities in fishing a year. And 24,000, again, if we look at the maritime sector today, the average, and used to be worse in the past, the average amount of fatalities these days in maritime sector is about 300 a year. So 20 years back, 25 years back, the ILO came out with this figure of 24,000 fatalities in fishing. In later years, the FAO said, "Well, look, there's more fishermen now than there were back in 2000 when this figure came out." So the FAO started talking about 32,000 fatalities, and by this stage, I mean, the mind just goes numb. What does 24,000 a year mean? What does 32,000 a year mean? But we, in our work that we do, when we were speaking to fisher folk in Bangladesh, when we were speaking to fisher folk in the Caribbean, when you find out in the Caribbean, on one island, just before I arrived there on one of the missions, 7 fishermen had been killed. They said by pirates who'd come from mainland South America and attacked them. This was in Trinidad, which is just off the coast. And stolen their boats and engines. I mean, those are fishing fatalities. The guys are fishing, they were attacked and killed and that type of thing. So when you start speaking to people in the fishing sector, in the global south countries, in the small scale sector, we thought that even 32,000 was just massively underreported. And we then, a couple of years back, we did an in-depth study into looking at fatalities in the fishing sector. And we came up with a figure of 100,000 plus. So that means, it's using our figures that we got, and they certainly had much more academic rigor than the ILO is happy to admit with their figures. But 100,000 is something like 66 Titanics a year. If you like visual comparisons. So we had the Titanic, 1912, 1,500 people died there, but they all died together, and it was news and all types of things. Every year in fishing across the world, we estimate that the equivalent of 66 Titanics, 100,000 people, are dying.
Wow.
And even our estimates, we think is still underreporting it because there's a major problem in that there is no system, nor is there a requirement to collect data on fishing fatalities. So we did the study and we pulled in a whole bunch of stuff and we'd use social media, we'd use just about everything, everything unscientific, everything unacademic. We used everything else that we could. We had whistleblowers, we had reports looking at other things. In RNLI in the UK is a good example. They were looking at drowning deaths in Lake Victoria in Africa, and they came up with a figure. And part of that research said 90% of those fatalities are fishermen. So there we had a piece of data. So we could from different things we put this all together. The upshot of that is that we are now and have been pushing for a number of years, setting up a repository for fishing fatality numbers. And the reason for that is unless there's really good evidence, unless there's really good data, the interventions that we currently do, and we tend to just focus on training fishermen, and that's not really working. It's part of the solution, but it doesn't help if you have a trained fisherman, and I'll use Bangladesh again because we've worked there and we've trained in safety there. It doesn't help if you have a trained fisherman in Bangladesh who then goes to sea in a boat that's way past its sell-by date, simply because he can, because there's no government requirements to check the seaworthiness of the vessel. He goes to sea, he starts sinking, he can't call for help because there's no requirement for radio communications or via satellite communications, and he couldn't afford it anyway. And even if he did call in, there's no service to there's no rescue services to go and help him. And then he sinks and he drowns because he doesn't have a life jacket, because again there's no regulatory requirement for him to have a life jacket, nor can he afford something that is not required by law. So we need the evidence, on how much or how many fishes die, and we need to know how they die, and we need to use that information to make sure we putting the right interventions in place. And the right interventions might be concentrating on keeping the boat afloat. In other words, seaworthiness standards, life jackets and life rafts and that type of thing, and put our money into that. We might save more lives that way. Simple connectivity, just in terms of the tech that's available these days, but there's a price to that. So
Yeah.
maybe we should look at aid money and make sure all the boats are connected via satellite, because then at least they can get warned about storms, and they can get, if they are sinking or in trouble, or the engine stops or somebody dies on board or gets sick on board, they can call for help. So our foundation is setting up this repository simply because there isn't one, to find out how bad the situation is, and then to use that information, that evidence, to start looking at where do you tackle the problem? How do you best tackle the problem? Because we're not sure that we're doing the best that we could with the exceedingly limited funds that are available.
And
Sorry, just one final thing. One of the things we found with our 100,000 fatality report is that actually the numbers, I don't want to say they're irrelevant because that sounds terrible, but they aren't the really important bit. The really important bit is that our study found that the situation was much worse than anybody thought. And secondly, we actually don't know how bad it is because there isn't to capture the information. I said in maritime, if a boat sinks or a fish is killed at sea, it has to be reported. Chances are it gets investigated. That information is then fed to the IMO, who consolidates everything together and learnings. And if there's a real problem in the area, there'll be discussions and maybe law changes and that. In fishing, there's none of that.
yeah, it's quite a shame, really. And really, when you look at the numbers, it's kind of a slap in the face of reality, isn't it? It's astonishing, quite frankly. I think
Yeah.
another area that I'm quite interested in exploring with you, because we're hearing it a lot, you touched on the role of technology, and the first thing we should look at when it comes to technology with the fishers is at least a basic level of connectivity, so these guys
Yeah.
can connect to the shore and also have a little bit more awareness of what's actually going on externally around them. Would make a huge difference. But the other side of the other side of technology, and that we're starting to hear a little bit about the industry from the commercial side, is autonomous shipping. And I know that a lot of this autonomous technology is being rolled out to the smaller vessels and the tugboats, etc. Do you think that autonomous shipping could ever be applied to fishing?
Define ever.
Yeah, sure. Okay. In our lifetime. In our lifetime.
Well, certainly not in mine. Carl, I think, I mean, if you think of the small scale sector as essentially farmers, there's no tech on board millions of vessels out there. They are simply using their skill and their learned knowledge and from their forefathers or whatever to try and identify where the fish is. They don't have fish finders on board millions of vessels. They've got a set of oars and maybe if they're lucky an engine on the back that takes them out to their fishing spot and then they put the
Yeah.
net down or the line down or something. So they for and so I'm taking the side of the small scale fisher. For the vast majority of those guys, there isn't the finance or the inclination or the means to do that on the vessels they have. The other side is I said something right in the beginning that for the vast majority of people in this sector, this isn't a job. It isn't something you do 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. It is who they are. It is absolutely, they're feeding their family, they're feeding the community, they're using that money to try and educate the kids and better their life and all types of things. I think there's a hell of a lot more we can do and we should be concentrating on before we even start looking at
Yeah.
any sort of automation. Not that the idea is bad, it's just not, I think, applicable to the sector. And even if you look at the large commercial vessels, so far from that. I mean, as an ex-mariner, I'm involved with IMAREST. I'm a fellow with IMAREST, so we do work and we have special interest groups looking at autonomous vessels and all types of things. And two comments on that. One is whenever I speak to grumpy old ex-mariners like myself, we always say, never, it can never happen. The reality is it can happen and it will happen. And you're absolutely right. With things like harbor tugs, that's a classic example of where I see autonomous vessels will come in.
Yeah.
Short haul, ferry services. Maybe not between New Zealand's North and South Island. We've got enough issues there. But, it's certainly in some parts of the world where it's an easy, straightforward run. You could do that. Going back to fishing, I think even in the large vessels, there's too much that's constantly changing and that requires I'd almost call it human instinct as opposed to human knowledge to are we on the fish or and that type of thing. So
Yeah.
possibly that's the next step down the
Yeah.
line.
But for some, it's not even a consideration because this is just, yeah, they need a life jacket, not an autonomous boat.
That's actually a really good quote. They need
Yeah.
the life jacket first. We've been involved in projects where we've tried to collect life jackets and take it to countries, and for various reasons, it hasn't been successful. But I always found it quite interesting that in the developed part of the world, we spend millions on campaign to try and get fishers to wear life jackets.
Yeah.
And there's big campaigns going on all the time, and it's good, but we never seem to make a difference.
Yeah.
There's probably parts of the world where fishers will sell their kids just to get a life jacket, you know, because a life jacket, it's a luxury. It's an absolute extra. As I said, it's not required by legislation. Yeah, and just totally different look on these things.
Crazy. Do you think one of the other things that I wanted to discuss with you, and I'm not going to individually pick out companies or flag states, but something that we see sometimes, especially in the media, is the concept of unethical fishing.
Hmm.
mass fishing scale in an unethical manner. Again, not going to mention anyone specific,
You're being
but
very kind about the words that you're using.
yeah, no, but, well, I'm just being careful about how exactly I say it because like I said, I don't want to upset anyone listening. There is something that we see a lot in the media is fishing farming on an unethical level. What research and knowledge have you gained around this area, and is this something that's getting better or worse?
That's an interesting question. There's certainly much more knowledge about, we call it IUU fishing, illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing. And the data suggests that something like 20% of fish that's caught falls into that category. So if you think about it, out of every 5 fish, one of them is caught illegally in some other way. Western, global North countries aren't exempt from that in being involved in the IUU business, and we certainly won't mention countries there because some of them might be quite close to you. And then the fish that we eat that comes into our supermarkets and shops, a good percentage of that is derived from IUU sources. Now,
Really?
absolutely.
So the fish when we're eating cod and fish and salmon etc. from Sainsbury's, some of that has been caught illegally.
Let's leave some of the names of the shops out, but let's just say that 20% that I'm talking about isn't confined to, obscure countries across the world and all types of things. There's a fair amount, and there's a really good chance that some of the fish that we're all eating in all our countries is derived from illegal means.
Wow.
There's a slightly further and really sad part of all that. We talk about the dark side of fishing because there really is. There's slavery, there's murder, there's abuse, there's fishing observers that are killed, always falling overboard. There's some real massive problems out in the industry. I've been in corruption, slavery, modern slavery. In fact, very close to you. There's been 2 cases of modern slavery in the fishing sector in your part of the world that's been reported and that's gone through the court. But in many parts of the world, fishers are under false pretenses pulled from landlocked countries and essentially sold to fishing boat captains. And the first thing they do is take their passport away. And then, for the next 4, 5, 6 years, you're stuck on a boat. You can't go ashore because you belong to the boat's captain. And you're abused and sometimes you're killed and dumped overboard and all types of things. There's a really dark side to fishing, unfortunately, because of remember I said something like 17% of the world's protein comes from fish. What that means is that globally, every person on average eats something like 20 kilograms of fish a year. It's every single person on planet Earth. The average consumption, per capita consumption, has doubled since 1960. It's now something at just over 20 kgs a year. That's massive, massive numbers. To be able to fish without all the rules and regulations and checks and balances, it's a profitable business. So if you think of human trafficking and fishing, drugs, those are all really powerful industries for potential abuse. And as I said, fishing isn't immune to that. There's some real issues. The other side of the IUU fishing, of course, is what we found in our studies when we started looking at that 100,000 figure. In fact, we coined a new phrase which I now see being used. We talk about IUU by necessity. So fishing is changing for a lot of the coastal states and some of the inland, fishing off lakes and stuff. Climate change is changing and moving the fish away. In Africa, lakes are drying up. So previously, where there's 3 or 4 countries bordering one lake, and each country had, fishers, and they kind of got on and they caught enough fish. And now the lakes are drying up. They having to cross borders on the water to try and keep themselves and their families alive. So we call this illegal fishing by definition, but it's by necessity to try and stay alive. There's no criminal intent, but there are other issues, and that's changing it. And there, I was asked by somebody at a conference a few years back, what kills people at sea? And it was an interesting question. Yeah, we tend to think from the mariner side, your vessel sinks or your vessel burns or you get gobbled up by a machine or you get pulled overboard by a net. But in
Yeah.
fishing, you can also get shot by some other fisherman who doesn't quite like you by, armed with an AK-47. You can get eaten up by hippopotamus in Africa somewhere, or crocodile. In Bangladesh, you can get eaten by a Bengal tiger if you're fishing down in the forests, or as we know, happen to strand up there when your boat sinks. There's all Trinidad. I gave you that example of pirates coming out to steal your boat. So there's all manner of ways that you can die in fishing, and they're all relevant because you were out there catching fish to feed your family, your community, or the world. It makes no real difference at all.
So Eric, as we come to the end of the podcast and we wrap things up, I guess one of the most profound things I've taken from our session and our conversations has been that, unfortunately, although fishermen do have such high risk attached to what they do for a living, it has become normalized, and perhaps that is why we don't see enough media attention around it. If a tanker hits a bridge in America, or two huge vessels collide and a fireball comes,
Yeah.
these things immediately catch the attention of the media. But those small little fishing boats at the back that get knocked over and forgotten, not spoken about, is sort of sat in the dark, in the silence, because it's been so normalized. And my question to you then, I guess, to end the podcast, is what can we do as an industry to change this? Because it's not normal. And as you said, it's at such if you look at it from a scale, we're talking about thousands, tens of thousands of people dying all the time, and a lot of it is preventable. So what's the next steps?
Well, interesting question, and really good question to finish this off with. Just want to go back to something. The study that we did when we started looking at the fatality numbers, we subtitled the "Dying in the Dark," and we called it that because we were looking at, metaphorically, the dark being the lack of oversight, the lack of attention, the lack of anything. And that is the answer to this issue. We have to get the different UN agencies, because it sits right up there, to get involved. We have to get legislation in place. We have to get these conventions ratified across the world. All fishing nations have to do that. We have to get this body of regulatory governance in place. Without that, fishers will continue dying in the dark. If there's no legal requirement on national governments to do something, to record, to make fishing safer, to record the number of accidents, to pass that data onto a central agency like the IMO, the industry just remains too difficult. It's a difficult industry to monitor, but you're absolutely right. We can't carry on ignoring it. We have to start doing something, and that starts with the strong legislative framework, because that's how nuclear has become safe, that's how aviation has become safe, that's how medicine has become safe. Fishing is the most hazardous industry in the world. We can't keep on ignoring it.
And maybe the way to capture the attention of the public is to break down, 20 kg of fish per year, 70% of your protein coming from fish. You're just going to the shop and buying it and not looking at that pack and thinking where it's come from, how it got there. Maybe breaking down that journey is the key. Absolutely. I'm a marketing guy myself, and I think that's probably a good place to start, is breaking down that journey to the wider public so they can get behind it. But really interesting stuff, Eric. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me. Like I said, this is a part of the maritime ecosystem that I don't look at, but now we've spoken about it, it's one that I'm very interested in getting more involved in, because I think it's time. We developed this podcast as a platform for the voice of the seafarer, but even the word seafarer is so broad. We need to incorporate everybody that works at sea, even those in the dark. Sad stuff, but a lot of opportunity for change, and hopefully people like yourselves can drive that change and have done till now. But it's a big job. You've got a big job on your hands, that's for sure.
Carl, thanks very much. And maybe let's just leave the audience with a hashtag that we use quite often. And the hashtag is quite simply, we are all seafarers.
Well said. Thank you, Eric.
Excellent. Thanks very much. Thanks.